Hey folks, welcome back to my shop. This afternoon I'd like to go through the process of building one of these trout nets. I've been interested in doing these since I've been using laminations for furniture. I've been watching folks on social media build these things from time to time and thought I'd give it a try. If you stick around, I'll show you some of the pitfalls that I ran across and some of the best practices that I've found so far. This is what they would refer to as a 15-inch net, and that would be the dimensions from the top to the bottom of the throat. I just randomly selected the shape based on the circumference of the replacement nets that I bought online. I'll go through where I picked those up as well. So stay tuned and we'll get on with the project. My original cawls for the net were made out of 3/4-inch MDF. Here I am putting the two halves together so I can take it over to the router and end up making two pieces that are a mirror image of each other. What I need to do with the center portion of the form is to make essentially something that looks like a donut. Here I am marking and cutting out the centers. So I may be getting a little ahead of myself. The ultimate goal is to lay out a set of forms on a flat sheet of plywood so that you can work the hoops around the forms. I laid out the circumference of the hoop using a very minimal grid system of so many inches down from the top, so many inches over from the center line, and then transferred those over to the board very similar to the way you would do in a lofting process of building a wooden boat structure. Let's go back to the original concept. Here you can see me mounting the inner hoop onto its working surface. Notice that I've doubled the thickness of these members. As you can see here, my first concept was not to use exterior cawls on the hoop. What I found was that I could not get the clamps close enough to each other, and I had ended up with gaps and separations in between where the bearing force was between the clamps. I eventually made 4 nets using this concept, but as you can see here, I nearly used every clamp that I had in the shop and was limited only by the available space around the net and the cawls. So in an attempt to use fewer clamps and to get more even pressure around the hoop, my first solution was to put external cawls on the hoop as shown here. So here you can see the concept of the external cawls in practice. I needed to use fewer clamps because the cawls were able to give even pressure around the hoop. What I found out though was that the MDF was deteriorating at the point of clamping, and I decided to use something a little more rigid, and in this case I used some ash that I had around the shop. What I found in this process was that the MDF was somewhat flexible and the cawls and the forms would form together better than the ash, which was very rigid. To alleviate this, I tried to put in a soft neoprene gasket type material between the outside cawl and the laminate material. So my final solution to date was to revert back to the original concept of having an inner form and then using spring clamps spaced as close as I could get them together around the circumference of the form. So now that we've got a form and clamping method pretty well resolved, let's turn our attention to the laminates. The laminates I use are taken from 3/4-inch material and are approximately 1/8 of an inch thick. I use 5 laminates per hoop. That gives you an opportunity to put the middle one in as a separate wood species for accent. The process I used to make the laminates is the same as I used when I was making laminates for furniture. I'd end up with a piece of stock that was planed on 2 edges. I'd run both those edges through the bandsaw, and then I'd go back to the planer and clean up the saw marks on each edge. After I've resawn all my laminate materials, I clean up the one side that still has the saw marks using my oscillating sander. When I was doing this for furniture, of course my laminates were wider, and I would run them through the planer. I was afraid that these laminates were too flexible and might get hung up in the planer. I don't have a drum sander, so this mechanism seems to be the best that I've got in the shop. Sometimes the laminates can be either a little too thick or the grain structure such that they're not cooperating. In that event, you may need to soak those. I built a soaking tube out of PVC pipe as shown here. When I did soak the laminate material, I found that I only needed to allow them to soak for probably an hour, hour and a half max. I dried them off after I took them out and used them immediately. The glue, Tight Bond 3, which is a water-soluble glue, is not impacted by the wet material. Another comment about the laminations. Several people on social media pre-formed the laminates after soaking them without the glue and let the water dry overnight, thus pre-forming the laminates prior to gluing. I found this to be very tedious, time-consuming, and the use of the Tight Bond water-based glue didn't seem to have any impact with the pre-soaking and using the laminates immediately. Let's turn to the handles now. This is really one of the driving forces behind me down the path of building these nets, because I have a lot of short cutoff pieces that I didn't really want to put to the burn pile. So I made a template which is 5 inches at the widest point up at the throat where it meets with the hoop. It tapers down in the middle to about 1/8 inch. If you add then the 5/8 on each side, that gives you a little less than 2.5 inches of a handle width. And the tapering portion is 7.5 inches roughly long, and the actual handle itself can be as long as you'd like it to be after that. Here I am at the bandsaw cutting out the handle curve section. I used the cutoff material as a clamping caul, but later on ended up making a standard set of clamping cauls. That way, when I glued up the handle blanks, I didn't need to extend down a full 7 inches. Therefore, I could use even more of my waste pieces in handle making. The glue-up process was pretty straightforward. I glued all 5 laminates at one time. Some people do this one laminate at a time, let it dry. I put glue on just one surface and then wrapped it around as you see here. I let the glue dry overnight and then pull all the clamps off, obviously, and then somewhat pry the hoop off of the form. You want to make sure you wax up your form and your cauls to make sure the glue doesn't stick to them. And believe it or not, when you pull the hoop off, the glue on the bottom is still a little bit damp and needs to rest overnight. Once the glue's dried, I take a block plane and trim the hoop down to the same thickness of the handle. I know I previously said that I used 3/4 inch stock to make the laminates with, but in actuality, if you could probably be a little thicker than 3/4, maybe 7/8. This is 4/4 lumber, and it's just a little bit too thick. Once I got the hoop and the handle sized to the same thickness, I then focused on shaping the throat of the net. I first rough cut the shape with the jigsaw, took it over to the oscillating sander to clean up the saw marks, and then took a file and sandpaper and shaped the throat. At this stage, I decided it was appropriate to put the groove around the outside of the hoop in which the line would be embedded for used in tying the net to the hoop. The original method I used was an 1/8 inch router bit protruding 1/8 of an inch, and I used a makeshift fence to guide the net. This method works okay. It's a little bit clumsy. I ultimately went and bought a specialty bit as shown here. This bit is a little bit bigger than I really was looking for, but it's the smallest one that they had without doing some specialty manufacturing. It's 3/32 inch wide and puts a 3/32 inch deep groove in. I used a 1-inch Forstner bit to put a hole in the end of the handle to attach a lanyard. And then finally, it's a matter of using hand tools to get the shape of the net and the handle that you want, or in some cases I used the router with a roundover bit. After I was finished shaping the net and final sanding was completed, I taped the net to the hoop and then drilled for weaving the line in that would attach the net to the hoop. The last step was drilling the holes before finishing. I applied 2 coats of BioShield Hard Oil number 9 and let it cure for at least 3 or 4 days. After I was assured that the oil had fully cured, I put 8 or 9 coats of Total Boat's Clear Gloss Varnish. This is the water-soluble product. I tried several methods of applying the varnish. First, I tried spraying it, but was unable to get a thin enough material to give an adequate coat. Second, I used the sponge applicator, which applied too much product, and I finally settled on just a small 1/2-inch brush, which gave a very good finish. And here is one of the net frames ready to install the net. I purchased the nets from an organization called Fish Pond out of Colorado. Here are the sizes that I used for the 2 different nets. The nets come with what I would call an extra large sewing needle and a length of black heavy-duty nylon thread for installation of the net to the hoop. I replaced this with what is referred to as a number 18 braided mason line, which is a nylon line. It's about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, or a little less. To thread the nylon line around the hoop, I used a small piece of stainless steel wire, which is essentially a threader. I took this off of a picture hanging wall. To attach the net, now it's just a matter of lacing the net to the hoop all the way around. I use a double half hitch at each end to secure the end to the net. And then after clipping off the nylon and touching it with a hot match to melt the end, I put a dab of CA glue on the knot to help secure it. So here's a finished net. I'll have more pictures of finished nets at the end of this, but first I want to go through another couple of little hints in making these nets. After applying the 8 or 9 coats of the varnish, you can imagine that the holes would become plugged for threading the line. The best thing I found to clear that out was to take the chuck off of the drill press, install the 3/32 drill bit that I used, and just clean them out by hand. To add accent, sometimes I will use a contrasting color of plywood edging. This is the same stuff that's heat sensitive that you put on with an iron. Before you can use the edging that's heat sensitive, you have to remove as much of the glue as you can. I do this with a hot iron and a putty knife. You can't get it all off, but just to make sure that we're getting a good bond, I did the traditional test and found that the board broke before the bond did. Well, that's about all I've got on net making, folks. I'll close by showing you pictures of the nets that I have built. You know the drill. Hit subscribe, thumbs up. We'll see you next time. Happy woodworking.